Linda Melvern, thank you very much indeed for coming on Rwanda Beyond the Headlines.
Thank you. I'm really pleased to be asked. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I interviewed somebody you might know a little while ago, Andrew Wallace, who is also a journalist who has strayed into academia somewhat. And you've done more or less the same, really, in that you're a holder of an honorary doctorate from a university in Wales in recognition of your journalistic work. A lot of that has been on Rwanda, and your coverage of Rwanda starts very early in the 1990s. So I thought now that 30 years, of course, since the 94 genocide against the Tutsi, it would be good to look at that work, primarily really through your books. You've written about 3 books, if I'm not mistaken. There might be more, but 3 books on Rwanda.
If we can go back, please, to the beginning of your question there, and you make a distinction. Yes, you make a distinction between journalism and academia. I was an honorary professor at the University of Wales, but that was all. I didn't have an honorary doctorate, so I think we ought to get that straight. I'm a British investigative journalist, and I trained on local papers and then national newspapers. And I worked for a newspaper called the Sunday Times, which was a pioneer in investigative journalism, where a team would descend on a story, if you like, and pull it apart. You know, it wasn't unusual in the Sunday Times for 4 journalists to spend up to a year on any one story. And then, of course, to have what we used to call review fronts in the newspaper of articles we now call long form, but which in the days of the Sunday Times were feature-length articles. So I still see myself as an investigative journalist. The reason why I published in academia so frequently was because of the information I had and the refusal or the reluctance, let's put it that way, of the British press to properly document what I consider to be a colossal event of the 20th century, which is the genocide against the Tutsi. I don't think it has been properly reported at all in Western newspapers. That may come as a surprise to some Western journalists who've done some magnificent work on it. And I think what has emerged over time, and is so obvious to me now, and I didn't notice at first, is that there seems to be different rules, journalistic rules in the West when reporting Africa. Not just Rwanda, when reporting Africa. So that is a problem. Now, the second part of your question was how I came to start my work documenting the circumstances. My third book was a history of the United Nations, an alternative history, if you like, of how governments used the system and abused the system of international cooperation through the United Nations. And it was my third book. And Channel 4, a television company in the UK, decided to do a 3 one-hour series based on the book. And the last program in that series, which was broadcast in January 1995, was an interview with Colin Keating, who was the president of the Security Council in April 94, and an explanation of what UN peacekeeping was, how it had been used as a camouflage very often by Western nations, and what one could expect it to achieve. So the first part of 1 hour on peacekeeping was Somalia, the deaths of American servicemen in October 1993, just a few days before the United Nations Assistance Mission for Rwanda was created. So I was in New York in April, May, and June 1994, not constantly, but I was there at the Security Council, knowing what was happening in Rwanda, knowing about the reports that were coming into the UN and the failure of states to do anything. The indifference and the apathy was there for all to see. And from that moment on until this day, I have reported the circumstances of the genocide against the Tutsi, and we have only just begun.
We've only just begun. And now it's sorry to cut you short there. It sounds as if it's almost exercising journalistic ghosts, because you're sitting in New York and seeing things that ought to be happening and stories that ought to be told, and no one is telling them, and somehow you are intent on telling those stories and bringing out what ought to be brought out.
It's not just a scandal, though. I mean, stories were chosen at the Sunday Times because they were scandals, and this is massive. I mean, this is so huge. It was intimidating at first. I mean, and yes. I think to some extent now, when you think about the reaction of governments whose first actions were to hide whatever they knew, to cover up the decision making. It was convenient for them that the Security Council discussions on Bosnia in former Yugoslavia and on Rwanda in '94 were held in secret. And the reason that I knew that I was to write a book on this was just weeks after, about September, October time, when someone gave me an account of what was said in those secret meetings. I had that information very early. I published that information in January '95. We knew about Colin Keating and Carol Kavanda, these two ambassadors in the council, along with Ibrahim Gambari of Nigeria, trying to get action for Rwanda and failing, and the processes within the UN that prevented them from doing so, from the failure to properly inform the non-permanent members of the council of exactly what was happening in Rwanda. One of the most shocking things that anyone said to me at that time was Colin Keating, who was the president of the council, the Security Council, making decisions on Rwanda, who said to me, we were kept in the dark. He said the non-permanent members of the council were kept in the dark about what was going on. The permanent five have big, costly intelligence gathering apparatus, and yet the non-permanent members in the council do not have that. They rely on the Secretariat and the UN for information.
And they kept to themselves.
Yes.
Now, you mentioned something interesting, which is that we're only just beginning in writing this story. I want to come back to that a little bit later. As far as I am concerned, really looking at the coverage of Rwanda, looking at the way that Rwanda is and has been covered, I don't think that we see you nearly enough in studios, because simply because really you do have all of that since 1994. All of this information is within your campus, and you have done really punctiliously followed what one is supposed to follow on these things. In essence, there are an awful lot of people that present themselves as experts on Rwanda. You do have real expertise on this. So it is interesting that one doesn't see enough of you. And I want to suggest that one of the reasons is that for some reason, is that people have decided to tell this story in their own way, irrespective of the option to find the actual story. In other words, this is a deliberate misinformation as far as I can see.
Who's going to correct it? You see, this is the problem. You will find this not just when it comes to Rwanda, but you will find false information in one story, in one newspaper, which will be picked up for years to come, with no checking, no proper journalistic scrutiny at all. And I think that this has happened when it comes to the circumstances of the genocide against the Tutsi. I think there's been an awful lot of unverified information out there, which, of course, as you know, has been compounded by the denial of genocide, which started, in fact, in the Security Council as the killing was proceeding. The blueprint of the denial campaign that we see today was first articulated in the Security Council of the UN in April to July 1994. As you probably know, Rwanda had a non-permanent ceasefire and flew of history, an irony of history. I mean, it's absolutely appalling that the representative of a government, the interim government committing genocide, should have sat throughout in the council. I mean, there again, it's scandalous. It's almost beyond belief that this should happen with no accountability.
Now, what has happened as a result of that is that that has formed the basis on which Rwanda is covered and what is understood. Now, let me be a little bit charitable to most journalists. You're an investigative journalist, so you will spend as much time as it takes to follow the facts of a story. A lot of journalists don't have that much time, and they will grab things here and they grab things there, and it's possible to make a mistake in good faith. But getting to looking at, as I say, the way Rwanda is being and has been covered, it is very difficult to argue that a lot of the mistakes are in good faith. It is, I mean, it is, I don't know everything about Rwanda by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm fairly well informed about the place. But even when I'm going to look at certain areas, say in 94 and so on, I go and find your work. They could do exactly the same thing, but they don't. And they're very well experienced, bright people. So this is a phenomenon that I find puzzling.
So do I.
And what I'm really,
what I mean, what am I to say that, you know, standards have slipped since the great days of the Sunday Times and British journalism? I think in some quarters it has. I think the coverage of Africa, as I've said, you know, there seems to be different journalistic standards. I mean, let's take just one example of what everybody calls the trigger of the genocide, the assassination of Javier Romana. Well, I mean, it's almost laughable, the reporting on that. You know, it's and it's easy journalism, isn't it, to claim that that you have special knowledge and that you know, whereas in fact you're being taken in by some unscrupulous opponents of Rwanda. I mean, the whole thing has become ludicrous. I think that's what you're referring to, is it?
Well, let's try and correct a tiny bit of the record, a drop in the ocean, if you like. One of the examples that has very little to do with our discussion today, I have not seen all of it, but I've looked at the debate on this UK migration agreement in the House of Lords. And the House of Lords, for anybody who doesn't know, is the upper chamber of the British Parliament, is quite justifiably often praised for the expertise that is in there, people from all sorts of backgrounds, and you know, a lot of very distinguished lawyers and so on sit in the House of Lords. But one of the really the ill-informed comments about Rwanda within that debate are extraordinary. I mean, basic things like Rwanda is a one-party state. Well, you know, the RPF-led government has never, ever governed on its own at any one given moment. there are at least 4 other political parties within government. For somebody of, high intelligence, experienced, to look at a system where no party is ever allowed to govern by itself, and this has been happening for 30 years, and then pronounce that it's a one-party state, is bizarre in the extreme. And this offhandedness, this almost contemptuous attitude to a place about which you want to speak. I mean, one can ignore Rwanda if they want to, but if they want to speak about Rwanda, the basic information is there, So the question really here is, I don't know. I mean, what does Rwanda do to say, well, look, this is who we are? They cannot enforce it. What do they do to say this is who we are? And how does it communicate through journalism, through the media, any differently than they have done? I mean, can we put the onus on them, for instance?
I too watched some of those debates, and from the perspective of someone who's been reporting on the genocide against the Tutsi for 30 years. And what shocked me about it was that there was no one in Parliament that I could see, that I heard, who actually properly described the genocide against the Tutsi. It was variously massacres, it was variously a horrible time, it was variously a tragedy. 200,000 people. One of the parliamentarians said, in fact, that the RTLM had demonized the Hutu. I mean, it was extraordinary to watch this, and it sort of is testament to my own failure, if you like, that the genocide against the Tutsi in this country is just so little understood. It's extraordinary. Whether or not it would change if we put one of the 5 suspects that we have here, they're category 1 suspects. They are people who had a determining role in their own localities in the murder of hundreds of people who walk our streets. Perhaps if one of those genocidaires, or all 5, was put on trial in this country, then perhaps things might change.
Let's come to that actually then, because I mean, you're aghast watching that debate in there, and I suppose in a way the explanation is there is no interest. There is no reason for all of these, as I say, experienced, highly intelligent people to bother to do any work. But then again, they seem to be able to find the information that subverts the truth. And that's the information that one hears. So if they're going to make the effort to find what, I won't mention any names, what the agenda-driven journalists and academics and media people say, why can't they find the effort to contact you, look at your work? So it seems, it's puzzling. I find it puzzling, and I don't quite know why they would do that.
You've left one thing out of the equation here. One thing out of the, and that is, and I don't think we've seen it fully yet, is the power of the genocide denial campaign that is being run from Brussels and from Paris and from Quebec and from Toronto. It's in all our major cities. And, I think that one aspect that is really badly misunderstood is the role of propaganda at the time. The power of RTLM, which I think we're only just beginning to understand. Jean-Pierre Chrétien, he's a great scholar of this in France, who said that he believes that RTLM was more powerful than the Nazi propaganda that was spread. And I think we are just beginning. I was surprised to learn that some of the recordings of RTLM are yet to be translated. You know, they're sitting on shelves at the ICTR and they are yet to be translated. So an understanding of that propaganda will show you the efforts put into the propaganda we are facing today. And it has been extremely successful. Let's not kid ourselves. It has been very, very successful.
Now,
and
you more or less, sorry to interrupt, so you more or less almost in a way looked ahead on that in your last book on Rwanda, correct me if I'm wrong here, Intent to Deceive. Within that, you do talk about these 5 people that the UK is yet to try. Another person I interviewed fairly recently was Dr. Bramatz, who is the chief prosecutor of the residual mechanism for the Rwanda Tribunal, Criminal Tribunal, and the former Yugoslavia. And I think he makes the point that it is incumbent upon each state that it is a signatory to all the obligations under the UN to either try these people who are guilty of or accused of crimes against humanity, or extradite them. Now, the UK is a major nation, and its legal system is much admired around the world, and they simply don't seem to be bothered. I think that is the only word that one can find. In your book, you do make the point, I remember, that one of the reasons that the judges give is that to try this case properly would involve too much work.
Well, that's a new one on me.
Yeah.
It certainly would. And I think the Metropolitan Police investigating today, I thought these cases were prepared. I understood that these cases from the Westminster Magistrates Court too, that these cases were prepared. There's enough information already on these.
It should be a little bit more accurate. I think not that it would involve too much work about the information, but for the judges to find time on their docket. That
yes, because
yeah,
yes, well, that's too bad. This is genocide. This is the crime of crimes. You don't put this in at the back of the queue.
Yeah,
this is at the front of the queue. The British government, we've signed the Genocide Convention. The Genocide Convention requires states to prevent and punish the crime of genocide. So we are obliged to do it. Whether or not we take those obligations seriously, or whether we see them in fact as obligations at all, is another matter. But genocide can't be put to the back. It should be right at the front. Now, it should be a priority of everybody's judicial system, I would have thought.
Yeah. You covered the first trial, well, the only trial that there has been, pretty comprehensively. And in fairness to the judge at the time, she was sort of somewhat convinced that there was a serious case here to be answered, but the little technicalities were all over the place, in a way, getting in a way of trying the case properly, like the introduction of Paul Rusesin, with whom she was not in any way impressed. I mean, I remember vaguely in your book, you can be a little bit more accurate on this for me.
Paul Rusesin in 2008 traveled to London and testified on behalf of one of those who is accused in our country of committing genocide, allegedly. And he tried to prevent him being extradited. When the magistrate came to decide on these cases, and initially the magistrate said that they should go to Rwanda, he determined that nothing that Rusesin said could be trusted. that he was quite clearly a proponent of the Hutu power movement, and that he had greeted these people warmly in court. It was absolutely devastating from the magistrate in 2008 on Rusesin. So there's a question for everybody who who seems to think this man is still really a hero, although that has never been, you know, that has never been mentioned once, I don't think, ever, in Paul Rusesin's record, certainly in our parliament.
In a way, that's really what the point I'm trying to make about your work and what is compared in a way to, or in contrast to, the stuff that we get in the media right now, and the efforts from other people. You will find that detail. And that detail is either missed, and I gave two really scenarios. One of the journalists and academics who are gender driven, but are also really some of them who are fairly stroppy, and just simply pick up the work of those who are agenda driven. People choose to pick up the agenda driven stuff rather than come and find what you have done. People will have people at Rusesin go to court. They will not look at the work that you've done and bring in the people that will give them the truth. There is a tendency to want to avoid the truth. There's a tendency to hide things here. Or again, am I overstating the case?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm astonished. I have written to parliamentarians. In fact, I actually once wrote a letter to Christian Anamapour from CNN, who did a whole item on Rusesin, to tell her that no, he wasn't a hero in 1994. And there are witnesses who testify to this. One of the witnesses who testifies to the fact he was not a hero is Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire. There are peacekeepers that I've interviewed who were in the lobby of that hotel who tell about the role of Rusesin. And the Rusesin as hero is a result of sloppy journalism. Now, how many people after the genocide do you think changed their stories? I mean, it was a common occurrence. And Rusesin told one journalist that, you know, he'd saved these people, and suddenly the story takes off. And from then on, people are meant to assume that what Rusesin says is true, and what everybody else who was there says is false. This is a ludicrous situation. I can write as many letters, it would appear to me, but nobody takes any notice whatsoever. I find that really shocking. I find it shocking. The facts can be just so discarded in this way.
I'm going to come back to the point you made earlier, which is that we're only just beginning to talk about this story. Would you explain a little bit more what you mean by that? I mean, we can end on this really, because it tells us where we are. And what, in your view, needs to be understood beyond correcting the misinformation, of which there is plenty.
There is, and I think that that is the primary task. I think it is so important that while we have these facts, I think we should use them, and we should challenge denial. I think it's very important wherever it occurs. So I think that that really is a primary task. But when the genocide against the Tutsi in July was finally over, I think there was a scramble by governments to try and hide their own roles. You know, the UK isn't Norway or New Zealand. We're a permanent member of the UN Security Council. At the time, our ambassador was so skilled in diplomacy, Sir David Hannay, that they used to call him the king of the council. You know, he used to put his arm round Madeleine Albright and say, "Don't worry." You know, there was this this attitude within the council. that I found shocking to this day. And I was interested that Keating, Colin Keating, in his own remarks for the commemoration, the 30th commemoration, is still talking, as he talked to me then in 1994 about reform of the council, that the council should hold its meetings in public session, that there should be a recognition of Africa, that there should, that the veto should change. So Colin Keating, knowing the damage the system caused in April 94 when he was president, and how, it's the predictable genocide and it's the preventable genocide, knowing what could have happened then, is really important for us to remember. I was looking through, I have a whole filing cabinet drawer on the humanitarian intervention in Rwanda in 94. And I have the speech made by James Orbinski, who was MSF in Rwanda at the King Faisal from, I think, May, June onwards. And in his speech, when he accepted the Nobel Prize on behalf of MSF, he talked about reform of the council and how terrible it had been in 94 and how different, in fact, it could have been. So I think, there are still huge issues to do with that. I think that that really could be a legacy. Maybe we'll have to wait another 30 years. I'm in a country where they seem incapable of understanding what happened in 94. So yes, there is a great deal of work still to be done.
And I actually would like to, we'll ask you again on if we may, but at a later stage, what in the last 4 minutes we have left, the work you've done in mind and where you started in mind, I mean, the last 30 years are within your compass, really. What would you say to young Rwandans who are within, whether it's the media, whether it's in academia, to look at in what is, after all, their story? What would you say to them?
Oh, give me a chance. Let me meet them.
Yes.
Where do I start? There's so much still to do. I'm quite happy to hand over whatever queries. I have notebooks full of queries and whatever I have to a generation of Rwandans. It's up to them. This now really is up to them.
Well, that's
I couldn't have done this work had I not been in New York at that time, really, and had I not spoken fluent French. This is the last genocide planned on paper. We can be sure of that. The archive has to be taken care of. I just urge Rwandans, journalists, just get in touch with me. I have a million questions I can give you about this.
Well, that's a good note to end on, so we can start on it the next time we'll ask you to come on. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you, Vincent. Thank you very much for asking me. I'm very glad to have done this with you.
Thank you. Great pleasure.
Thank you.